Five, four, three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel, my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We are out here in the Canadian Rockies, still trying to find the grand unified theory of human movement, biomechanics, how to feel awesome, move awesome, and be awesome in the human body. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about, well, a bunch of different things, as we always do. But Will had a cool little DM thread with someone who asked him a specific question that we thought was going to be a great place to pivot off for our conversation today. He sent a message saying, Kneesovertoesguy versus Joel Seedman. Who do you have in a 1v1 of training styles? So we're going to compare the 90-degree training style of PhD Dr. Joel Seedman, who is convinced that it's the most biomechanically sound way to lift weights and train strength for athletes, versus Kneesovertoesguy, who also touts athletic performance and longevity of joints. We're going to kind of pivot off the conversation from there. So initially, any groundwork that we want to lay out for this conversation in terms of our own position about training and movement that you want to establish for people who are listening right now?
I guess really it comes down to energy movement for me. Neither system touches that. They really just say strength, mobility, and stability automatically transfer somehow by just naturally over to your actual athletic movement or movement in general. I don't think that that's the case. I don't think it's specific enough. So neither address rotary movement, neither address spiraling movements in the body, neither really touch or talk about fascia within the body. But there is bits and pieces within each system that I do really like. So I think we really have to dive into the nuances here, because I could just say, when somebody comes at you with like, which one's better? It's like, I don't really love either one of them, but there's parts of either one that I would take, and I do put in specifically into my own work and work with my patients, right? So let's dive into the nuances here. And I'm really going to ask more questions than I am answering questions here. I'm gonna try.
Okay, interesting. Because so from my end, just a bit of my own background here. I have never trained the Joel Seedman 90-degree weightlifting style. I have seen all the memes about him. I have been on his page. I have seen the ridiculous party stunts that he seems to be doing with some of the extreme stability stuff, the offset loading, the unstable loading surfaces, and the extreme heavy loads that he puts onto his athletes. But I have done the ATG system, which is the Kneesovertoesguy, right? And I have experienced the pros and cons for myself in that system. The same sort of issue that I have with the Kneesovertoes system is the same thing that you expressed, is the lack of rotary movement and the emphasis on, if you see Kneesovertoesguy, I mean, obviously he's doing these long lunges with his knees over toes. He's got the slant boards where he's doing the VMO squats, and they're really, really deep and straightforward. And I built that movement up really, really intensely during my year of doing the ATG system. And I experienced knee pain whenever I moved outside of that particular straight back and forth range, right? So I never really had knee pain prior to, I was doing, conventional powerlifting barbell back squats for, around the 405 pound range with no pain in my knees whatsoever. I'd never really experienced knee pain, but specializing in that movement and that range of motion made it so that when I was moving outside of that range, it felt stiff. My tendons were definitely adapting, but they weren't adapting to any rotary motion whatsoever. And so that was something that I noticed in doing the program. Maybe it was that I had pushed the movements too hard and too fast. Maybe I didn't align my feet properly, or what have you. You could break down some nuances or speculate why I had knee pain. But for a program that specifically is meant to help bulletproof your knees, my knees didn't feel bulletproof, right? And so that was my own personal experience. But there were a lot of things that I really liked about it. Prior to pushing it really, really hard and getting to that point where I was kind of achy and felt like I had to be careful about the direction that my knees were going, I felt very bouncy. I felt like my ranges of motion were much longer and more free compared to when I was doing just conventional lifting. Because you're training a lot of end range stuff. So the actual access to ranges of motion generally speaking, because you're training them more, you gain more access to certain ranges, right? The question is, what's the point of diminishing return for having access to different ranges of motion? How much range is necessary range? How much range is good range and athletically applicable range? So that's just a little bit of a background in terms of my own experience. I've never done any Joel Seedman style training, but I did like over a year of ATG knees over toes stuff.
Yeah.
So that's my background.
We'll talk about principles of each as well, because I've never dove deep specifically into either one, doing a practice myself, right? Mm-hmm. But I know the principles and I know what their underlying philosophies are. And I think we should start off by looking at this how an average fitness person would look at it, which is, do I go down halfway or do I go all the way and try to do a full range of motion, right? Because the average person isn't thinking about much. They're just, I see Joel Seedman pop up on my Instagram and he's going halfway with a bunch of NFL stars, therefore, and claims that it reduces injury and you can get strong just in that range. So therefore, I should do it too. NFL athletes are doing it. I can do it too. And then there's the knees over toes. It's like, no, I'll progress you into a progressive overload, which is all the rage right now and has been forever, right? Progressive overloading into a full range of motion so that if I do it slowly and I can feel these positions and get my body used to these positions, let's say a knees over toes specifically in a squat, then if I do it during basketball game, I should be bulletproof, right? Mm-hmm. So I did it slowly. My body's felt that mobility. I've adapted to it. Therefore, when I do it in a sport or in life, I will be adapted to it in motion. That's the part that I don't agree with. That's the part that I don't think actually carries over into real life movement, because real life movement is largely rotary, maybe jumping. This is a different story. Jumping is a specialty, by the way. Everyone wants a higher vert. It's a specialty and largely genetically determined, I think. Sorry to break it.
Based on like fast twitch muscle fiber composition type thing, or what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's only so much you can do with it. It's kind of like having somebody who squats naturally just picks up a barbell and squats super heavy right off the get-go. Mm-hmm. And then there's other people who can build up, through a system a higher squat, right? I think somebody who spends 10 years, is not genetically gifted in squatting, can get themselves up to a 500-pound squat just following programs over and over and over again, right? Mm-hmm. The science is there for that. People have done it. And not only the science, it's really the hundreds of thousands of people have got really strong doing programs, 3x8, 5x5s. I know I'm going to get roasted for that. There's many different types of programs out there that mess with periodization and volume and intensity. It's pretty mapped out, right? So you can get a strong squat, but there's people who can do it right away. Okay, so that's kind of like an aside with vertical. Basically, do you only go halfway down, or do you go all the way down? Or in bench press or in motions, do you go all the way with your movement and express full range of motion and make your tissues stretch, or do you only go partially halfway down, right?
So I think the principle that Joel Seedman, when he's doing the halfway down or the 90-degree angle stuff, is that you can load it more safely. Right. And so you can have a greater stimulus, a greater strength or nervous system stimulus, or a greater tissue stimulus, because you can load it more. Right. And this is the same argument of like, should you train bilaterally in a pattern that emulates the gait cycle, or should you train bilaterally in a squat that you can load more? Right. Because you can create more force production with the bilateral linear movement versus this rotary unilateral sort of lunging style movement that will emulate the gait pattern, right?
Yeah.
The question is like, what are the negative byproducts of training a bilateral movement in a linear way when you start to translate that to unilateral or reciprocal movement that is, or contralateral running patterns, like gait patterns? And we have a ton of episodes about that, and we don't have to dig into it here because we're talking about 90-degree versus long range training. the argument that Kneesovertoes and like a Keegan Smith, for example, would have is that long range training creates tendinal strength over time, right? And so you'll be able to develop stronger connective tissue in that end range, and the thicker tendons and the thicker connective tissue is going to help prevent injuries at the joint level, because again, you're resistance training that end range at the joint. You're creating a thicker tissue so that when you are, in an elastic situation or a dynamic situation in movement, it's less likely to tear, right? I think when we interviewed Keegan Smith, he even said a thicker rope or a thicker wire is less likely to snap, right? And so that's the mentality, and I can actually see the logic. I can understand where the mentality behind that is. Keegan Smith has trained rugby athletes using this situation, and his team has the lowest injury rate within the rugby league. What does that mean? In terms of it, does that mean that ATG and his methods are better than the other weightlifting? Yes, 100%. Does it also mean
say so too?
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like ATG is a more sophisticated way to lift weights and to prevent injury in a lifting capacity. So as far as lifting culture goes, I think they're one of the best systems going. But do they have relatable patterns that are biomechanically sound? That's the sort of debate that we would bring up.
Well, yeah, I agree with all that. I think they're solving problems of lifting for the most part, right? I think lifting presents a lot of problems. People get injured doing it and need something to be solved with a barbell, right? When the solution might not be in the barbell. The solution might be getting back to a natural pattern, but then it's all about mixing in different aspects too. It's like athleticism, injury prevention. These are not the same things, right? So, and hypertrophy. People want to have it all. It's like, I want the big muscles, I want to be injury proof, and I want to be athletic. It's like, yeah, okay, so you can have it all, but you'll have to spend a lot of time doing it. Okay. And if you only have a certain amount of time, like an hour or 2 hours a day, which most people, I mean, the average person doesn't even have that or dedicate that much time to it. You have to be as specific as possible with what you're doing. Now, the other thing is there a natural pattern to human motion? If there is, I would want to train to that. Neither of these systems, Joel Seedman's 90 degrees or ATG, again, they don't aspire to this. They don't even mention it. Mobility, if you have good mobility, if you have good stability, and you have good range of motion, that's it. That's the pinnacle, right? So, and it's achieved through length with strength with ATG, and with Joel Seedman, it's 90-degree training. Why would you go all the way when you can get all the benefits and all the tension in only 90 degrees and hold isometrically and have in unstable implements at that 90-degree motion, right? So I kind of want to play a Joel Seedman clip here. It's about 3 minutes, but it really does explain. He explains the 90-degree training himself.
Okay.
Why it's maximal and why it's actually full range of motion. So the title of the video is 90 degrees is maximal range of motion. Let's hear his arguments and let's talk about it.
It's maximal range of motion right here. I can't go any deeper. However, I can also do this.
Can you hear it?
So the question is, which one is my maximal range of motion? Okay. Answer is, they're both my maximal range of motion. The one where I go all the way down into the ass-grass position, that is maximal range of motion under passive conditions where there's very little neuromuscular activation going on. The first one that I did, where I went just to 90 degrees, right there, okay, that's maximal range of motion under active conditions. The reason why I want to point this out is because people always say, well, Joel, why do you always do partial range of motion? Why don't you ever do full range of motion? And my response typically has been, that is maximal range of motion under the conditions of keeping everything fully engaged, okay? Core fully activated, posture locked into neutral, okay? Feet fully activated and straight. We don't want energy leaks, not unless you're doing ballet, okay? But for sports, we want straight feet unless we're cutting or if there's a force vector that's moving us into a different direction. But if the force vectors are perfectly vertical and everything is stacked, then we want everything straight. So again, to keep everything square, to keep the knees, hips, feet, ankles aligned so they're not bowing out, caving in, okay? To keep the feet from rotating out, to keep my pelvis in that neutral position, again, to maintain full body tension. The maximal range of motion you can go to is 90 degrees. And that's not just for me, okay?
So I'm going to stop it here and talk about this a little bit because he said a lot there, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that I don't really agree with. So he's basically saying that you're going to lose all your tension when you go past 90 degrees. You can maximally be tense at 90 degrees. That's kind of true. But at the same time, we're not static statues that just like in life is motion. That's when you're standing still. I'm not a linebacker. And most people aren't either, right? So why would you want to be neutral? Neutral is never happening in real life. Okay. So neutral, the way he presents it here, both feet maximally pushing. He's talking about vertical forces. Where are the vertical forces in real life? That's lifting. Again, back to the lifting. Okay. So, having
where would there be vertical forces in real life, like other than the downward force of a gravitational pull? Like, what do you reckon are there vertical forces that show up in movement in real life? Like if you're landing a jump or
exactly gravity on a counter reaction for trying to jump maximally. That's it. Right. And there's somewhat vertical forces when you're moving, but it's not that clean where it's like a weight dropping on your body and you pushing against it maximally in neutral. That doesn't happen. Real life motions don't display this.
So I'm gonna just like do a hypothetical devil's advocate here, right?
Sure.
What if you're trying to establish strength and force production from that neutral position? Because when you are experiencing dynamic forces, like let's say in a sprint, you want to be able to default back to that neutral position, even if there are spiraling motions, even if there are lateral and spiraling motions, you want to push in orientation to that neutral position. And if you have higher force output from that neutral position, you'll be able to reorient towards that neutral center point. And then when you release it, kind of like it's the back and forth. And so the neutrality, the 90 degrees, you're almost training the center point strength. And then the dynamic forces are happening outside and around that strength in that center point. Does that make sense? That's the devil's advocate.
It is. I mean, that's the mainstream argument. That is the theory that's there right now. And I think that is true. As closer you get to a linear movement, that's going to be true, with the most true being lifting weights. Okay, so sprinting is close to, it's still rotary, it's still three-dimensional, but you're going straight and you're just pressing as much force as you can. If you watch Joel Seedman sprint, I don't know if we have a video of it, you'll see what it actually looks like. He looks so robotic, and it looks like he's trained 90 degrees a lot and being super stiff and stable a lot, and it displays in his sprinting. But back to what I was saying before, one, the spine to me is supposed to be an undulating wave. Here we go. Let's watch this. Watch how stiff he looks. What do you think of that?
Well, again, when you're talking about the rotary movements, there's not a lot of rotary movement happening.
And to play devil's advocate, people would be like, there's rotary movements happening at every joint. But like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about smooth energy motion that goes throughout the body. When you watch a smooth mover like Usain Bolt or even Jacobs, maybe I shouldn't use sprinters, but when you watch a smooth mover like a Michael Jordan, you'll see an energy wave, energy flowing through the body. Martial artists, dancers really display this beautifully. And that's why we look at them and be like, okay, they move beautifully, right? Israel Adesanya is another example, right? Even though he lost. He lost to a stiff guy, by the way, who had just more power. There you go for a Kneesovertoes argument or a powerlifter argument, right? Even though, you get what I'm saying there, right? So basically what you were saying before, the argument that, yes, stability does have a small component, but the stability that the industry is playing to right now is stability in lifting and a static body, where stability to me means the rotary components of your body can come back to neutral after doing their rotary motions. Okay, so the hips move in a overhead pattern in a figure eight. I'm going to argue, if you really break it down, if you really watch, the spine will wave back and forth, whether you think it's a massive side bend, it's not, it's a small side bend, but it's there, and energy is flowing through the body. Energy flows through every system. if you look at any system in nature, it flows and the energy just doesn't stop and then start again. It flows somewhere. Okay. So the same thing happens with the body. So I think that since people don't recognize, again, these natural patterns of, I mean, we can go back to previous episodes to talk about that, but if you don't recognize a natural pattern, yes, stability being neutral position, as he was talking about, 90 degrees, having your muscles flex, like there's no muscle effort as you move, okay? Your muscles are firing automatically, and it's the tensions throughout your body that are guiding your movement, not you purposefully making yourself tense. That never happens, okay? So especially at the core, when do you brace your core during a movement? Never, okay? So unless you're doing something heavy, again, it goes back to the heavier you go, the more you're going to brace your core. And I'm talking, it does brace, but automatically, right? It doesn't brace purposefully in movement.
In movement, so in a sprint or a punch or a throw, like there is some sort of core tensioning that happens, right? Like, but it's not the same core tensioning as like bracing to protect your spine from bending under the load of a deadlift, for example, is kind of what your point is here.
Yeah, like basically it's like the more you go towards heavy output, the more you're going to have to brace your core, and the more appropriate it is to brace your core. But in movement, in locomotion, in daily life, you want to relax that to get better motions. Okay, so I think both systems use stability in that way. So I don't think either one of them's correct on that. And this is my opinion personally here, right? And it falls in line more with the like spinal engine theory. Okay, I want to relax as much as possible as I'm moving. Okay, I want everything to be relaxed. Even a lot of people recognize this in the face of a sprinter. Like when you watch the face of a sprinter and it's nice and relaxed, it's like people want that when they're sprinting, but then want the rest of the body to be tense. It may be appropriate in a sprint at 40 meters to tense your body, but you'll never see that type of tension in a marathon runner who has to display their movement for a long time, right? So again, the more power you need to display at one exact moment, the more tense you're going to have to be, and the more appropriate this model of stability that Joel Seedman and the rest of the industry is playing to is appropriate. But in real life motions, it's detrimental. So there has to be nuance there. You only need it at times when you're putting out high force output, like jumping, like weightlifting, like sprinting, short distances, but that's it. Those are specialty items. Those are not real life motions. 99% of people will not even do that at all over the age of 30, right? So
do you think that there would be possibly less negative byproducts of lifting to 90 degrees if you're not training that like full range of motion, you're staying as close to neutral as possible, you would have less compensation patterns as a result of that versus other things? So like I'll give the example of like an OKF argument. He had a story today. And he said, I don't know who needs to hear this, but your body doesn't just remember positions because you train them. Example, sitting in a squat with your knees out doesn't mean you'll land a jump in the same position. If you squat with knees in and neutral, you lengthen your glutes while strengthening them so your body can express movement with less compensation. If you squat with your knees out, your glutes get shorter, causing something to compensate when the glutes try to lengthen in a real life jump landing. So he's saying, he's talking about the compensation effects of doing a full range of motion squat when you're pushing your knees out to create more room in your hips to get deep. And I used to do that a lot, right? Like I used to push my knees out at the bottom of a squat so that I could get my hips below my knee line. Okay,
so we're going back to the dungeons of biomechanics here, because that's more of a loaded question. I like OKF 100 times more than I like Kneesovertoes, by the way, or Seedman, or 90 degree training, I should say. But I don't agree with him here on everything. First off, I do agree with him here that there's way more to gaining internal rotation of your femur and room there, and the glutes do expand as you do that, but they also expand when you push back. Okay, so yes, like the Kelly Starrett type of squat where you're pushing your knees way out, where he used to cue that. Yeah, that is contracting the glute. So the glute is getting contracted like a muscle, like I'm doing this with my biceps.
Yeah.
where I want to do this and be able to move my arm in every direction. If I'm using it as a whip when I'm throwing or using it as a whip when I'm punching, I don't want my bicep to be tight. So I don't want to teach it that. And the other thing is, yes, you can teach your body certain parts or certain positions to be in. That's the whole point of sport training. If that wasn't true, you wouldn't be able to learn sports. Okay, so it's pretty ridiculous to say that you can't train behaviors to do that. However, because you're training it, whether in his system your feet are turning in, you're training that, are you not? So
and this is the go-to argument against OKF, is that like even if you're creating extra room within your internal rotation, because a lot of that is like he's developing increased internal rotation at the hip by maintaining that slightly internally rotated position while you squat. And so, you know, in squatting and resisting that external rotation, that compensation pattern, you're lengthening and loading the glute more. But, you know, Goda's like, well, you're still outside of your columns. You're still training this behavior neurologically, especially if you're putting it under load, you're doing repetition. You might be gaining the range in the room within the joint, but it's contextual to the movement. Right. And so Goda is like a pure pattern approach. They're like, here is the observation of the patterns that we see in nature and the indigenous cultures and the athletes. And if we don't emulate that, if we go outside of that, we're going to neurologically reinforce the patterns outside of that, essentially.
So I think you can do certain patterns without neurologically imprinting them as long as you don't do it a lot, right? So this is like, if I wanted to learn Spanish, or like if I didn't want to learn Spanish, I would only do it one day and then learn Portuguese the next day and then French the next day, right? And then I would lose my Spanish, okay? Because I didn't practice it over and over again. Maybe that's a simple analogy, but it's there, right? But
the question is, like,
I can learn Latin
consistently, but don't you need to, like, wouldn't you not even get the benefits of the exercise if you're not doing it and sorry to interrupt there, but like for me, it's like, but you need to do these things repetitively in order to actually adapt to them. So it's like, if you want to create like a tissue change, that takes a long fucking time. You need to do a lot of repetitions over a long period of time. And the more focused and the more intentional you are in doing these exercises, that the more the result that you get. So ultimately it's like, okay, yeah, you can do these exercises and not neurologically imprint yourself, but what are you actually getting from it? Anything? Are you getting any positive adaptations if you're not doing it over and over enough to the point where you would have a neurological adaptation? Because tissue and neurological adaptations happen coincidentally, right? Like they happen together.
So we're moving more into a Goda versus OKF debate here, right? So well, from Seedman and Kneesovertoes to Goda and OKF. I'm going to tell you what I think here. One, you load a bow 100% when you move. Okay, so I like to train in a bow, but do you also get into internal rotation as your leg moves through that pressure wave? So yes, that's true as well. So I want to train both. So I do train both, right? I don't go purist in one or the other. Would I rather train internal rotation if I need it to get through my gait cycle at the cost of being in my columns? Yes, I would. Okay. And I found ways to train it closer to within the columns. I'm not a purist Goda where I go straight like one fist width distance between my feet. I don't do that. So I found ways to kind of have a happy compromise there. But let's get back to the Seedman 90.
Yeah, of course, right? Yeah.
Because only the deepest of the deep biomechanics nerds would know what we're even talking about.
Yeah,
there.
I know. And you know what? Like, the reason that I brought up OKF is because I find there's a little bit of overlap with some of his ideas with Joel Seedman's, right? Like Joel Seedman's idea is that like he's trying to create fewer compensations by going to these 90-degree ranges. And he's trying to strength train in a way that will preserve biomechanics or is biomechanically efficient. Now, how well he does that is debatable, right? And that's, I guess, what we're debating at the end of the day. So what, in terms of the just rewinding back to the ATG idea of the thicker a wire, the harder it is to break. You know, if you are thickening your tendons and you're strengthening these ligaments and you're going to these end ranges, in theory, couldn't that protect you from injuries in dynamic situations? theoretically? Or is it because you're adapting specifically in a sagittal plane, you're using sagittal plane and frontal plane movements to adapt to these things that it wouldn't translate to dynamic or rotary movements?
I think it's like compared to what you're doing. If someone's just sitting on the couch or an office worker, please do Joel Seedman training. And you know what I mean? If you're going to do nothing else, do that. If you're going to do nothing else, do knees over toes. But if you want to actually see the effects of what you're doing, that's what I'm going to talk about, right? So I kind of lost my train of thought there, but basically, if I was training Joel Seedman style, I see a lot of stability training, a lot of body being tense, and you see it in his sprinting. Okay, so I'm going to make the leap here that you're going to become more tense as you're moving energy through your body. I wouldn't want to be a dancer and do Joel Seedman's training. I wouldn't want to be a marathon runner and do Joel Seedman's training. I wouldn't want to be an energy mover and do Joel Seedman's training as the optimal way to train. If I was a linebacker, possibly. I'm holding that steady 90-degree position. I think his training is very specific to being stable in 90 degrees at the end of the day.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. What about you?
Fair enough.
What do you think there?
So I'm, like I said, I shared my experience doing the Knees Over Toes program where I could ATG split squat over my body weight. Like I was doing a 205-pound barbell front rack ATG split squat for 10 sets of 5 per leg, right? And I was able to handle that quite well. And I was like kind of cooked, and that was like an every minute on the minute set for both legs. So I was really strong in this movement. But again, when it translated to dynamic movements, or I had to squat, whenever I tried to squat and push my knees out slightly, or I moved outside of that linear range, my knees hurt. So it's like, okay, like I obviously have really strong end range tendon and like muscle strength. But as soon as I move outside of that range, or I start to get like a twisting action, then like it really hurts. Like that thickness, it like almost made it more brittle if I'm in a rotary situation, right? So I think it's contextual. It's how far you push it. And again, like we've talked about this, like if tendinal thickness and tendinal strength and connective tissue is like the most important thing for injury prevention, then why aren't powerlifters the most athletic? Right? Because powerlifters, like in that deep squat range, like these guys are doing ass to grass squats, some of them anyway, with like 500, 600, even 700 pounds. And they can't even do a box jump without, possibly tearing their groin. Right. So the tendinal thickness thing, like there's a point of diminishing returns to all of this. The question is like, in what context? Now, I do think that there is something to the end range stuff. And like I said, I got a lot of benefits from moving from linear lifter who was like kind of like really bound in his own tissues, and having an extended range of motion was beneficial to me in certain ways, right? So it almost reversed some of the excessive chronic tightness that I had in certain areas. And it did it in a beneficial way because I was building strength in these end ranges. But the thing that I keep thinking about lately is like even strength in certain end ranges, just because I can access this range with tension and with tissue integrity, does that make it good automatically? Because because our argument is always how does the body maintain tensegrity? How does it maintain that balance of tensions and compressions to naturally hold and support your system, not outsource tensions to parts of the body that are inappropriate, like your lower back, like your hips, like your neck and what have you. That equal balance of tensions and compressions naturally just like holding your system in place, that's a delicate balance, right? And that's a balance that's based on efficient biomechanics and the capacity to transfer energy well. So if you're getting into the middle splits, or you're able to do this like super, super long range ATG split squat where your hip flexor is like crazy extended and you get this nice long abdomen and all this stuff, it's like, okay, cool. But what does that translate? What's that optimizing your system for?
So we're talking about energy movement here, right? So I think that that's the natural blueprint of human motion, is that the joints are like gyroscopes. Okay, they have multiple planes of movement. That's why I don't like the cadaver anatomy language that I learned. Okay, because when you get into motion, it's very hard to actually split apart what's happening, because the joints move more like gyroscopes. So the classical way and the theory that almost everyone subscribes to right now is like a pack the joint and release the joint. Okay, where like in ATG, you go to the end range and you feel that tension. It's like, when is that actually happening like that in real life? It's almost never. But the theory is that if you have access to that range, then if you get into that range, you'll be bulletproof. Why aren't yogis bulletproof when they move? Right? So it's kind of the same argument with yoga, because yogis are very flexible and can get into those end ranges but are injured a lot. With the power lifter that you mentioned on the other end of the spectrum, where shouldn't powerlifters have the most injury bulletproof systems out there and most athletic because they have the thickest cords? Okay, because neither one of them work. Not the yoga, not the I'm not going to say ATG works, but yoga doesn't work to be injury proof in the long ranges. When you're talking energy movement, okay, I see it all the time in the office. And the powerlifters aren't injury proof in the energy movement within the strong cords of their body on the other end of the spectrum when it comes to energy movement, because they don't take energy movement into account. Because the body is designed to move in spirals. All these things are done in linear planes, and they're done with external force. Okay, so
the issue with that too is you're not just conditioning your tissues to adapt in that linear way, but it's also your nervous system is learning to fire in that sequence of linear patterns. And that's what you see with like Robo Sprint Joel Seedman going on, is like his body is used to rigid linear movement. So when he's trying to sprint, he's not getting that spinal movement going. He's RoboCop. That's how you're firing in sequence. And if your nervous system defaults to firing in that sequence, then it's it's subconscious problem solving for a high impact, dynamic, high speed situation is going to try to default to that linear movement. Even if it's going to screw you up, it's going to become, inefficient. It'll force your tissues to push and apply pressure in a particular way that could snap a tendon or something. That's the ACL tears and the Achilles tendon snaps that you tend to see on the field.
What do you notice from the fastest animals? Like, I just took a walk in the forest here, and I watched deer just galloping through the forest, and they were like hopping like 6-7 feet in the air, just pum bung bung boing, right? Their legs are this skinny. Okay, like it's the energy stored in the tendon. The tendon's supposed to be a spring that goes like boing boing, right? It's supposed to open up and close in an elastic manner. It's not supposed to stretch to an end range, get to that end range, and then go, oh, you're good to go, dear. You now have a huge range of motion. Like it just doesn't make sense to me when you actually do observation of nature that going in large range of motion is going to be injury preventing. Now, again, injury preventing, hypertrophy, longevity, athleticism, they're all intermixed when the conversation has to be way more nuanced. There are different aspects. If you want to go into the athletic realm, and a lot of younger men and a lot of younger people want that athletic touch to whatever they do, and they're already injury proof because they're young, then ATG and Joel Seedman's training, and especially ATG, is going to be very appealing, because it's like, I can dunk and I have all this range of motion. When you're getting a little bit older and you're not a professional athlete and you don't need that extra like 10% height on your dunk, or you don't need to lose 0.2 on your 40 time, then it becomes more of an injury prevention, longevity game. That's where that's my lens, right? So to to me, I'm doing observations of nature and seeing all these anomalies where I don't see big chords being and large ranges of motion as the number one thing. I see energy movement as the number one variable. Rotary motions, energy movement, spirals.
And I mean, like I'm sorry, I'm totally mesmerized by this deer running right now.
Yeah, absolutely, right?
Like totally mesmerized by it. And you can really see that elastic balance. And like you said, like very, very skinny, but hold on, like look at if you look at the tendons and stuff in the back there, it's like it's basically just using these huge elastics to bounce itself forward.
Yeah. Also, what do high jumpers look like?
Yeah, true.
You know, none of this, the long range training to me solves a lot of problems that are superficial problems. This is my opinion. Okay. So a lot of people do go into the gym and just do partial range of motion. Most people aren't that deep into this stuff, right? So they're already butchering 3/4 of what they're doing. So if they have a program where they can progressively overload into a range of motion that culturally looks like what should happen, I think they're going to get a lot of benefit out of it. Okay, so and you do adapt. You do adapt to a new range of motion. The benefit stops when you start moving, and you only have your body. You only have you and movement, or you can be a gym rat and just stay in the gym and you'll be bulletproof. Okay. So I'm not saying there's a lot of good parts of knees over toes, but I'm going to say that it has to move. Eventually you have to move. This is the key part. Eventually you have to move into a rotary model in order to sustain longevity of your body.
So what would you say, like you just said, there are some good things to the knees over toes. What would you say that, like, do you think it's only contextual to linear movement, or what are the good things that you would keep from it? And then like assuming that you're going to eventually apply rotary movement and spiraling dynamics into your practice as well.
I do like lengthening out your body. So for instance, I'll tell you what I do right now. I'm playing, I like to experiment, right? So I have the inertia wave, and I'm going way out and I'm stretching my pecs to the max, okay? And then I'm applying a vibration force at that maximal length, right? And I'm really working on, in my head, I'm relaxing my body and I'm spreading my rib cage out and I'm getting the maximal pull I can on my pecs, connecting that and getting what would be called a perturbation or a force outside of, like, external force that would act as an elastic at that long range of motion. So that's almost like ATG training, right? Length with strength. The difference is I'm going to go and do a rotary motion afterwards to apply that strength, right? To apply that change in the tissue, I should say. If I only stop there, I'm not teaching my body anything. Okay, so for instance, my friend said that his girlfriend hurt her ACL.
Yep.
She tore her ACL 2 years ago playing frisbee golf. She went to throw the frisbee, her foot locked into the ground, and her leg kept spinning. Okay? So what would stop that leg from spinning? Is it a thicker ACL, right? Or if you've taught your body behaviors of how to synchronize the rotary movement so that your heel doesn't hit the ground or your foot doesn't hit the ground and lock, and everything spins correctly in the same rotary fashion. Do you get what I'm saying there? So
yeah,
if I taught my body how to actually spin correctly, then she wouldn't have got hurt in the first place, right? You can have as thick a tendons as you want. If you've ever watched somebody elderly or very unathletic fall, and you're like, how did they, like, you'll see it in skiing all the time. People just fall over. It's like, wow, how did they fall over there and injure themselves going so slow? It's because the body does not know what to do. I've fallen, like, because I've skied since I was 3, I can fall at super high speeds do a flip, come back up, or not flip, but like I'll be on the ground and I'll just roll and come back up, right? Or I'll be getting out of situations that are just like hair raising, and my body does it automatically because I'm spinning everything correctly. But if I didn't, I'd be tearing something, right? So it is a behavior aspect there where if you can have as strong a tendons as you want. If you don't know how to move your body correctly in the sequences, you're going to injure something. You think that deer gets his ACL injured? No, never. Like very, very little, considering what they're doing. They're out in terrain. There's holes everywhere. It's like they're not injuring themselves because they're moving the energy correctly through their body. We are so far into gym culture that we believe that gym culture solves the issues, and then it's also the cure to or the problem and the cure to the issue, and then go out in real life and those stronger muscles and tendons will stop you from being injured as you move in a real life context. To me, again, you have to go back to the rotary model and learn the rotary model. Okay, learn how your body actually moves energy, which takes repetitive behavior, which is almost like athletic training, movement, okay, on top of biomechanics training, which is not like ATG. It's basically almost like an OKF, one of a kind fitness, great stuff, GOTA. You know, I could say functional patterns, but I don't know exactly what they do. And to the max, I like their fascial training. And WEC method, I like his stuff too, right? So those systems, you can't go wrong getting into that paradigm. It's a change in paradigm. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's funny because we were starting, like the whole beginning of this was, what is better, ATG or Joel Seedman, right? And again, what we're talking about is like, well, given the context that we view the body and movement in, neither one is optimal, right? And I don't think we actually got to a point where it's like, okay, but if you had to do one, right? Like if you had to do one of the two, and it's funny, I think I would actually do the 90-degree training because I feel like it's less time consuming. A lot of the ATG stuff is a lot of repetitions, a lot of time. And he has programs that are very like minimal time commitment, like 20 minutes a day, a couple days a week, or however many days a week, for specific things. But I also feel like I could do less of the 90-degree training and get as much of the benefit. And then I could, have the rest of my movement practice to do rotary stuff and to do dynamic, multi-dimensional biomechanically informed movements. And I feel like I would almost develop less compensations to my movement patterns from the 90-degree stuff. My main concern with the 90-degree stuff is that because of the high loads that you're putting on, it would be because it was like so neurological. And again, you're teaching that tension in those rigid positions, that it would negatively affect some of the some of the rotary patterns. So it's like it's a catch-22, because I mean I've done it. It's sort of like the devil I know versus the devil I don't. It's pure conjecture at this point, because I know how ATG affected how I moved and how I felt in my body, and I didn't mind it. I could jump really high. I was kind of springy. I was bouncy, and I had good end range and stuff. But so
let's talk about maybe the good aspects of either one, right? Like the 90-degree training, if you're already injured, isometric training is really good. So, and that's actually something I take in my own biomechanics practice, which just to me, that means getting into my hips and getting into more of a locomotive pattern, how you would walk and run, okay? And to me, that's a lot of working on the ranges of motion of my hip as it moves as you walk, okay? So a bow, for instance, okay? I use a lot of horse stance with an internal rotation of my feet and inside ankle bone high, which GOTA would be like, no, you're out of your columns. But I do it so very little to get so much. And there's a reason horse stance is great in martial arts, which I do quite a bit, so it carries over, right? But again, back to Seedman 90-degree training, I use a lot of 90-degree in my isometric work, but I don't do it loaded with a barbell. And what I do is I use, again, perturbations, which means either vibration or an external force like an inertial wave holding at that 90 degrees and holding into those closed packed positions of my joint to gain maximal tension. Okay, so tension is something I really play with. And I think both systems talk about tension quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
But I think Seedman is really like, you'll get the tension at 90 degrees, where knees over toes is like, no, you have to go all the way to get the tension. Then it'll pull on your tendon. Then you'll get the benefit, right? Also, any thoughts on that one?
No, keep going.
So another thing I mentioned already with the, let's say, going out, stretching the pec, okay? I don't think actually there's anything wrong with stretching, even in the yoga way. I just don't do it a lot, right? I think it's great to feel out your end ranges once a day, twice a day. I do it in something called, it's basically how cats stretch, cat stretching. Feel out your range of motion once, twice, 5 times a day, 10 seconds, feels great, right? Back to the knees over toes, where he talks about gaining blood flow. So he actually does the opposite of long range training, short range training, like concentric, like sled pushes or sled pulls, where it's more of a concentric movement, meaning that the muscles have to fire and there's not a lot of elastic tension, especially the backward sled drag, and that puts blood into the muscles. Now, I found other ways to put blood into the muscles with much less time and effort. High pressure cupping, by the way, and driving massive amounts of blood into the muscle and tendon and joint. So I don't do it like that, but I can see some benefit there, especially for people who work out a lot and are sore constantly and don't know that eccentric training is what's making them super sore. It's like, if you can split it up between concentric training, which means shortening the muscle, that'll make you less sore, and eccentric training, where you're controlling the muscle in a lifting paradigm again, then you'll be less sore the next day. Again, I wouldn't do any of it. I just go back to the easy biomechanics training that, Goda does, and I'm not going to say because I don't do OKF or functional patterns, but I've seen their models. I know enough to see, this is good stuff. So I like their stuff as well. WAC method, 100%. Any thoughts on that?
Well, and again, like, just appealing to the fact that you are very athletic, like even comparatively to when you were doing the, you posted that video of you doing your, 36-inch plyo push-ups. You were the one move explosive guy. You had the same thing, the 500-pound squat and everything. Like, we were both strong, but like right now, like you watch a video of you boxing, and the power that you have and the ability to express strength and power that you have is immense. And you're a lot more wiry, right? Like, you're a lot more you don't need a ton of muscle to produce force, right? Force production is not just like pure motor unit output. It's not just pure like muscle output. So I think a lot of it is paradigm of conditioning in terms of what we believe is athletic looking, symbols of fitness, symbols of status within the modern world, and wanting to chase these particular aesthetic ideals. Principally, like a lot of it is aesthetically and vanity motivated, I think. And the reality is, like, you see a big muscle, you think he's strong, you think he's athletic. That's just the reality of the world that we live in. But like, I'm also like, I remember like watching some calisthenics guys and these gymnasts and these people who are like insanely athletic, like insanely competent in their physical body, and they don't have, like, the most athletic people that I've ever seen are not thick, muscular people. Like, I think of even who Roy Gold is?
I do. I was watching him yesterday. I like his stuff. He's an OG.
Yeah, Roy is an OG. Roy Gold is a proponent of the Ido Portal method. I think he's one of the teachers at the Ido Portal method in Israel. And his movement is mind-bogglingly good. And he actually, he does the end range training, he does all that stuff, but he does it with the intention of actually force transfer. He actually applies it to like energy movement, just not necessarily in purely locomotive patterns, right? He's doing it in acrobatic capacities and brachiating capacities and different like more artistic expression capacities, right? So he does actually have a force transference element to his movement practice while doing a lot of the end range training, a lot of this stuff. So for him, it's kind of joint prep, but then he applies it in a dynamic way. So that was kind of an interesting sort of crossover. But again, like if you're talking about pure biomechanics, you're talking about becoming that deer, becoming that springy creature. Roy also spent years and years training 4 to 12 hours a day doing movement.
That brings up a point. Okay, so one, there is a lot of nuance to this because it does depend on where you're at to begin with. Okay, so a lot of people in their late 20s and 30s in the Western world are already kind of, their joints are locked up. There's a lot of, let's say the energy doesn't flow through the body well. Okay, so you've had an advantage if you have good range of motion in your joints from a young age. Second is, what is your goal? Let's say for me, something like a functional range conditioning or knees over toes, where you're going into large ranges of motion, will be great in a sport like jiu-jitsu or wrestling, where you need those large ranges of motion on the ground. Okay, so especially FRC would do better in jiu-jitsu to me than it would be in locomotion, because it doesn't take those rotary motions into account when you get up off the ground, but it does. It's like we'll make you a hip, right? And again, I'm talking FRC here, right? But there's not an application with the rotary motions of the body in locomotion. The problem is, too, I'm going to be honest, this is my real thought, that if people acknowledged throughout the industry that there is a natural blueprint to human motion, and you haven't been observing that in your own systems, a lot of things are going to have to change, right? So a lot of people don't want to admit that this is the case. This is why I think GOTA has a lot of problems getting their system out, right? They get blocked by everyone else in the industry because they share those truths, right? So even people who follow GOTA don't want to say that they do GOTA, because there is a simplicity to it that eliminates a lot of lifting, barbell training, throws out a lot that's already there that are golden cows in the industry. And when I started this, I kind of didn't know it. I was like, you know what, if I just tell people that this is how it's done and I give them logic, then people just listen, right? But that's not the case. It's more, I want to protect what I already have here, and I don't want to admit that there's a natural blueprint to movement, because if I do, then progressive overload, just progressive loading any movement, which is the narrative right now, we can progressively overload any movement and that'll be fine, right?
Well, even what you just described too is Naudi Aguilar's argument against conventional physiotherapy, where it's like, you guys don't want to acknowledge some of these principles of FP and the fact that FP is getting better results because it's going to threaten your professional integrity. It's going to blow you out of the water. Some physiotherapy is government subsidized, or covered by insurance. And so it's like, you don't want FP to be better than you, because you're going to lose your easy ride. And you can, right now you can continue to be mediocre because there's no one putting the fire under you. But we're doing better. Like, it's like, you don't want to acknowledge that there's something that could be better, or that could be more true, or that could be more efficient, or that could be more effective, because it threatens your professional paradigm. It threatens the idea that you're the gold standard, right? Everyone wants to maintain their gold standard and position of authority within an industry and within a field.
I don't think that's the only reason, though. I think there's an element of culture, and it's almost like if you're not the popular kid, you don't want to be the first to follow the unpopular kid, right? Like, even with GOTA, I've had people who I've debated, and I'm trying to debate the actual substance of what they're saying, and they're like, I don't like the practitioners because they came at me. They did something mean to me. And it's like, what does that have to do with the argument, right? But it does have a lot to do with the arguments of the actual motions, because we're living in a cultural, popularity game, basically, right? Where Ben Patrick went on Joe Rogan, he's like very open to not arguing with anybody. He just does his own thing, right? We're analyzing different systems here, so we're like, okay, this guy does this guy does this, but I don't see Ben Patrick going after Joel Seedman. I don't see him going after anybody. He's just like, this is what I think works, and I'm just going to say it, and I'm not going to argue with anybody. Maybe some of the people, you know, some of my trainers will. I don't see Kneesovertoesguy, like ATG trainers arguing with almost anybody, right? Where I do see, let's say, Goda's guys go after people, right? Like in terms of like, hey guys, this is the reality behind it. Look in slow motion here, what's happening. People don't want to acknowledge the slow motion a lot of times, right? Like, and again, it's based off observations, making observations versus scientific papers, right? So Joel Seedman is claiming scientific papers. He gets made fun of by a lot of other scientists, like you know, the physio guys and the Greg Lehman type guys who are, we have the best science guys. We have the best scientific papers, and Joel Seedman's cherry picking his 90-degree papers. And then Kneesovertoesguy, when I watch his video, he always talks about studies, but doesn't really lay them out. He's like, studies say that if I go down past this, that my VMO is going to be maximally activated. And that's basically all the general population has to hear, right? So it works, right?
You could argue, yeah.
I think that's the case, right? Like I think most of the general population, they're like, if you say studies say that this is the way it works, nobody's actually going to the study. Even a lot of the people who are into research base don't actually look at the whole study, right? Because they're behind paywalls, and it's hard to do that type of volume, right?
Yep. It's a lot of work to check your sources.
Yeah, and with like Knees Over Toes, when we're talking about truth here, there's a lot of marketing behind it, right? Like so, same with Seedman, same with most of the systems out there, where let's say Knees Over Toes guy will do a dunk. He's like, look, I was in knee pain for so long, and now I can dunk. And even my friend who was asking me about Knees Over Toes versus Joel Seedman was like, well, Kneesovertoesguy went from having knee pain to dunking, and it's like you're describing his origin story that he put out there, whether it's true or not. You're playing into his marketing, right there, right? Where even in his videos at the end, he'll do a dunk and then he'll do a splits, and it's like, look, mobility and strength, and that's what all the young guys want, right? They're like, oh man, if I could just dunk, you should see what would happen to me. It would be amazing, right? Like, there's that type of narrative behind it in people's own heads. And even like, I've watched a seminar, I think it was with Keegan Smith, but I can't quite remember, one of the ATG top guys. And they're like, we're looking for trainers who are up there, who are athletic. So you already have those athletic looking trainers. They're the alpha guys. And then everyone's going to be like, oh, these guys know what's up. And then, you know, you display your athleticism. And it's hard to get away from this. If you display your athleticism, you automatically know what you're talking about. If you train a NFL player, you automatically know what you're talking about. Not necessarily. I would rather see somebody who actually does it themselves, who can display it themselves, right? That doesn't actually necessarily mean it's correct if you display it yourself, but I think it's way higher up in the pecking order than training somebody or just being in an area. If you're in like Atlanta, Georgia, where Joel Seedman is, you're going to have access to a whole bunch of athletes because it's a hub. If you're in Chicago, you're going to have a hub of athletes. If you're in Banff, Alberta, where I'm at, there's not that many Olympic athletes. You know what I mean? It's
just, I mean, like winter sport Olympic athletes.
Well, I do work with athletes, but it's not like NFL and popular people.
No, yeah, working with an NFL athlete is different than working with like Solomon skier or like I when I was a personal trainer, I trained a guy who was on Team Canada for the downhill snowboarding team, right? And that was I would have trained him way differently now, obviously. Yeah. But I was training this guy, and we were trying to put on muscle because he wanted to be heavier, and it was like this whole thing. But like, training a downhill snowboarder versus an NFL player, it's a different level of social proof, a different level of social status that you get from that, right? So
it's very interesting because I've trained a bunch of guys like that, snowboarders, skiers, and especially ski cross guys and ski racers, they're actually in Joel Seedman's position a lot of the time. You know what I mean? That sturdy position. So maybe Joel Seedman's training would be better for, like, I would do more along those lines of that combined with actual rotary movement training, because they're still human. They still need their bodies afterwards. A lot of these guys are just broken by the time they're 30. Snowboarders and skiers, hips, like, we're in a mountain town here, and everybody gets their hips done. It's just turned out. Hips, knees, broken legs, like, constantly, right? See it every day. One of my, I'm not going to say who or anything, but basically somebody I know just broke their leg hitting a rock. Like this, it's early season here, and a lot of the rocks are hidden. They didn't even fall. They just hit the rock, and the femur snapped. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff like that happens. That, like, it's traumatic injury, and a lot of young people are getting surgeries here way more so than in other places, just because skiing and snowboarding is really hard on the body. I tore my hip skiing I'm going to guesstimate around 70 kilometers an hour, having my feet just turn out super fast, a long lever. And I just felt it. I felt a snap immediately. And it's like 4 or 5 years later, and I still feel it. And by the way, what got me better was doing more GOTA. Like, GOTA solved a lot of the issues I had in there. Not 100%, but that's where I really felt in my own body. I'm like, oh, there's something to this. Having that real experience does make a difference, even though a lot of people will be like, oh, there's no science behind it. It's like, experience is key, especially when somebody knows what they're doing and I have experience in CrossFit and training for 20 years. This is not the same as experience with somebody who doesn't have that experience, right? So what I'm basically saying is experience is thrown out of the window a lot of times. When people should listen up when somebody actually has experience in their own injuries, and it should be given more credence to listen to people's experiences with injuries.
Totally. It's funny because, like, the Banff point that you made there, because I got my shoulder surgery in Banff. Banff population is under 8,000. It's like 7,800 people in the town's permanent population. And I'm like, why does a small town have, like, specialized like a sport surgery unit? It's like, oh, right, because everyone's jacking their bodies up on these downhill winter sports. Like, there's always injuries. There's always going to be people who are getting these joint surgeries from these traumatic injuries on the hill, right? So, that's very interesting. So, in terms of, I don't think we came to a conclusive answer who would win in a fight, Joel Seedman's 90-degree training or knees over toes and in short range training. But I reckon we've provided enough information for people to kind of make their own decision which one is worth it. And hopefully they would just say, well, you know what, maybe I'll experiment with a little bit, but I'm going to focus more on my rotary movement. Guys, thank you so much for listening to the Art of Move podcast. You can find me on Instagram at anthony.manuel. That is Manuele. You can find Will at the Art of Move. Like and subscribe if you're listening on YouTube. And I would actually recommend watching these on YouTube if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because we do have these visual demonstrations. We pull up the videos. It is a totally different experience. Thank you so much for listening, guys. We will catch you on the next episode. Shoot us a message if you want us to cover a specific topic or you want to get us a certain guest on.
Have a good one, guys.